Right, okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to the conference, welcome to this workshop on sport for development, exploring global and local futures. I'll just give a few words of introduction to the workshop. I think I was reading on the train on the way here a chapter that was speaking about the explosion of sport and research in sport for development, and also the number of conferences that there are now in sport for development, and spoke a little bit about this one as well. I mentioned this one in part in this chapter. I'd like to think that the workshop today will be a little bit different in some ways, not unique but different from some of the others. We're very grateful to have people from both the global north and the global south in Tanzania and Ghana in particular, and also Ramon here by Skype from Australia. So a worldwide collection of people. We're also very grateful that we've got the opportunity that the workshop will be open access in terms of having sport and development, and Paul up here back streaming it live on the sport and development platform, and it'll be available. The presentations will be available after the workshop on there as well. I have to say that some of this has been possible due to a grant that we've had, myself and some of my colleagues here have had from the Levy Human Trust, that has facilitated some of the things and some of the people to be here today, which we're very grateful for. I hope we've got a really interesting sample of papers, and I think we've got a really interesting sample of papers within the workshop. In terms of timings, I know there was an email came out for those speakers in the room. An email came out saying 15 minutes and 10 minutes questions. We'll go towards 20 minutes in terms of time for presentation and leave as much time for questions, including kind of then hand over to the next person. We've also got the plenary panel at the end of today, where we're very grateful for both some of our African colleagues and also colleagues from more practitioner background in the UK who are going to be on that expert panel at the end of today. We've got more papers in the session than we thought, and so I think we'll also anticipate going a little beyond the scheduled close of 6 o'clock for the plenary panel today. So hopefully you can all stay with us throughout the workshop. We've got, as I said, we've got an interesting programme. We've got 3 presenters in the first session just now, starting with Ramon Sparge, who will turn lights down and hopefully you can see from Australia. I'll click through the slides as we go, and hopefully Ramon will be able to answer any questions and stay with us for the remainder of this session. Let me just get this up, Ramon, and then I'll pass over to yourself. Over to you, Ramon.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian, and thank you all for attending the workshop. First of all, an apology for not being able to be with you physically, which would, I think, have enhanced the interactive component of this particular presentation and of the session, hopefully, as a whole. But we make do, and thanks Ian for enabling this also in terms of putting the PowerPoints up. And I'm sure we can get through it in a reasonable manner. First of all, what I'd like to do is sort of stress that this is a collaborative project that is actually work in progress that I've been working on with my colleague Nico Schulenkorf, who's based at the University of Technology Sydney, who also couldn't be with you today. So I guess we're not the most reliable bunch, but hopefully we have some ideas that we can share with you that are of some interest to all of you and to your work. So our work today is on the issue of safe space and how we might be able to build safe spaces in sport for development. This is something, this idea of safe spaces, through conversations with Nico, we sort of came to the conclusion, look, this is a term, sort of a bit of a buzzword that is often used in sport for development and in development studies more generally. What do we actually mean by this? How might we conceptualize it? How is this actually lived and implemented in sport for development projects? And also, what are sort of the gaps, and how might we be able to address some of these issues better going into the future, both as scholars and also as practitioners or managers of sport for development projects. So that's sort of the background. So what we want to do today is, I'm going to start with 3 key arguments. Ian, that's the next slide on key takeaways. So if for some reason our Skype connection drops out infinitely, you have something to take away, and I've still done my job, I guess. Three key points I think that are central to what we're trying to argue here is, first of all, is that so when we think about safe space is not just an outcome in its own right, an outcome of sport for development, right? In the sense that it's critical to the provision of inclusive sport for development programs. But it's also critical within the process through which sport for development programs seek to leverage social impacts and outcomes. So it's very fundamental to the entire process of social change, is sort of the first point we're making. The second point is that developing or building safe spaces does not happen automatically, and it's actually a critical challenge for people involved in sport for development. So it requires strategic planning, local knowledge, considerable insight, and also sort of day-to-day management. And I'm going to give a number of examples from different projects about how that might be done and what are some of the key issues. Thirdly, and this goes basically to the heart of what our own project is trying to come to terms with, that is that a key challenge for sport for development is to experiment around safe spaces, where there is a need to find a balance between, on the one hand, demands of physical, psychological or cultural safety, terms that I will be explaining in a minute, with experience of risk-taking and creative tension. So safe space ultimately is not a space that, as in the popular sense of the word, is simply about being protected from physical harm or danger, but it's much more about safe space seeing it as a site of experimentation and innovation that actually key to development work. So, on the next slide, just a brief overview of what I'll be trying to do today. First, have a brief conceptual discussion around safe space and its application to sport for development. Secondly, talk a little bit about the methodology that we follow and actually trying to see how safe space is addressed in specific sport for development projects. Talk a little bit about the findings drawing on projects from Sri Lanka and Israel, mainly from Nico's research, and Brazil from my research, and how we try to synthesize these different projects to get a sense of what safe space looks like in sport for development practice, or what it ought to look like. And I'll end with some conclusions and some directions for future work, which is some of the work that we're actually trying to do ourselves as well over the next few years. So, on the next slide, around the issue of safe space. So safe space is in many ways a contested concept, and a concept that's in many ways underdeveloped. An issue that seems at first sight really clear-cut, but when you start to dig a bit deeper sociologically, it's actually a very complex concept. Actually, to apply it into sport for development practices is actually not an easy task. In its popular meaning, which is often underspecified, it's often seen in two interrelated ways. So one is a physical space, as I mentioned before, as relating to protection from physical harm and danger, and therefore so as physical safety. And what that often implies is, and we see this in all forms of sport, not just sport for development, is that there's a lot of red tape and policy, codes of conduct, licenses, working with children checks, etc., all kind of activity around safeguarding well-being within sporting environments and sport for development environments. Basically also from the perspective of that physical safety and thinking about that safe space as a physical environment. Now what's interesting here is that if you go back a step and think theoretically about safe space is quite well developed in three different areas: education, feminist thoughts, gender theory, and in performative arts. And if you start looking into those areas, straight away you find out that actually when theorists of safe space think about safe space, they don't talk about safe space in terms of being a physical space or relating to physical safety. It is much more at a sort of experiential and psychosocial level, a way of acknowledging and relating to others. So it's rather than a physical space, it's much more a figurative space, constructed through social relations. That's kind of the way that in our own work we're trying to look at safe space. What that means is, though, conceptually, that safe space is a multidimensional process. So on the one hand, there is this physical dimension to safe space, particularly in the types of projects that we have done work with. Physical safe space, meaning a basic level of physical safety, is an important requirement. So particularly in volatile situations, for example, in conflict zones or in areas with high levels of public violence, we cannot ignore the fact that physical safety is a key element of this. But it's not the only element. So another important dimension of safe space is the psychological or affective dimension, which has more to do with the establishment of trust, engagement, and creating non-exploitative environments, creating a common purpose and identity. And I'm going to give some examples of that in a minute. The third dimension is social cultural. So a space where everyone can feel at home and feel supported regardless of their social locations or backgrounds, in terms of, for example, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality or ability. The fourth one, and the closely related one, is the political dimension of safe space, which has a lot more to do with constructing a shared sense of community where there's respect for political difference and, in the best of situations, creating circumstances in which people feel less inhibited to share political views, to have uncomfortable conversations in a respectful way that can actually then lead to some conflict transformation in the longer term. Finally, and that goes back to one of the key points we made earlier, is the experimental dimension of safe space. So the idea here that to consider safe space as being an environment free of risk, discomfort and stress is actually a very limiting approach to safe space. One that actually stifles creative thinking, innovation, and actually some of the risk-taking and tension that needs to take place for social change to happen. So we kind of need to embrace some of these tensions, conflicts, and ambiguities that exist within sport for development projects, right, that operate in volatile contexts, if we are to produce any sort of longer-term, profound social change. So those are some of these key dimensions. And what we're particularly interested in is how these different dimensions intersect in practice. How they sometimes support each other, but also how they can clash and actually diminish the opportunity for the other dimension to flourish. So that's sort of a bit of the conceptual background. So on the next slide, a quick sort of application to sport for development. So far I've referred to feminist thought, education, and performative arts. Actually, if you look also at conflict studies and at development studies, you often find that safe space is seen as an important precursor or a sort of a necessary condition to community development and conflict transformation efforts. Without some form of safe space, however defined, there can be no conflict transformation. And rather you end up reproducing sort of the conditions outside of the particular project or program that you're running. Yet the specific applications of sport for development are very rare. So the best one that we've found, and we'd like to hear your feedback if you've got some other ideas on this, is the work by Marta Brady, who worked with programs that specifically catered for young women in the global south, and Africa in particular, where she looked specifically at two of those 5 dimensions of safe space that we mentioned. That is the physical and the psychological dimensions. And the physical dimensions she operationalizes mainly in terms of safe mobility, so a safe, secure venue, safe transport, so really those kind of physical logistics. The psychological dimensions, she looked particularly at issues around group formation and affiliation. How can we, in sport for development projects, create group identities and affiliation that provide a sense of psychological safety and build effective relationships between participants and between participants and educators, for example. So building on Marta Brady's work, we started sort of looking at these 5 intersecting dimensions of safe space in sport for development, acknowledging that Brady has done some fantastic work, but we need to broaden it out to also give voice to these other dimensions of safe space, which are seen as critical to this process. So just briefly on the next slide on methodology, I don't have much time here today to talk about it, and some of you might be aware of some of the work that Nico and I have done. So what we did is sort of a comparative analysis of 3 sport development projects in communities characterized by fragile coexistence. So I've been working in Brazil for quite a long time, particularly with a project called Vencer, which is run by local NGOs in favelas, shanty towns, and poor neighborhoods in Rio de Janeiro. Nico has done some work with Football for Peace in Israel, so a sport-based coexistence initiative focused on improving community relations. And finally, Nico has also done a fair bit of work in Sri Lanka with the Asian-German Sport Exchange, which is a sport-based reconciliation program that runs a number of projects in Sri Lanka. I think it's been running since 2002. So yes, very diverse projects, not easily comparable actually, so later on I'll flag that as well, how all of this is sort of really highly context-specific and situational, and there's no one-size-fits-all sort of approach to building safe space. Yet, nonetheless, it was quite interesting to see some striking resemblances. And the first one is that the extent to which safe space is explicitly considered and planned for within these projects is very limited. So they are built around an implicit understanding of safe space as an important process or condition, but it's not explicitly highlighted in program planning or implementation. And that's something that we picked up on quite quickly, and we then wanted to sort of draw on particular data that we had that start illustrating how these implicit understandings work in reality, and also what some of the key challenges are. So let me illustrate, just by briefly going through these 5 dimensions, drawing on some examples. So the first one, physical safe space, is basically about, as I've said, providing an accessible, accommodating space that provides safety from physical harm and danger. It's about a secure environment where practical considerations are, for example, about the choice of location or transport, as Brady suggests. So a quote I've put on the slides, I'm not sure whether you can actually read it, so I'll read it out loud. It's from one of the educators at the Vencer program in Brazil, who talked a lot about, and this was a very common issue about choosing the location for the project, was about how can we make sure we're not directly influenced by the violence that takes place within the favela, and particularly so some of the power that some of the drug factions hold within the community, that actually end up directly affecting your program. So sometimes even having to close sessions, etc., not being able to run the program, and also a constant threat of violence. So there's debates around organising the project, having the project site sort of on the outskirts of the community to provide a more protected and secure physical space for participants, where they can have relatively trouble-free and comfortable experience. Yet, I should mention briefly, in the eye of the time, that physical safe space not only relates to venue or transport, but also to how you deal with, how you organise or structure the actual activities of the program. So it has to do with teachable moments around, for example, do you modify the rules or demands of the game to make it less competitive or less aggressive? So it has to do also with aspects of physical safety, particularly for those who might be less skilled, for example, in a particular sport. So there's that element as well. So the second dimension, psychological effective safe space, their important practical considerations are more about group formation, team building, creating a focus on shared experience and emotional support and collectivity through informal and collaborative sort of activities based on teamwork based, which is something for which sport lends itself very well. So the quote here from one of the ACSAT participants talking about it never felt like they were at different parties. There was respect for each other, friendliness and support, and a sense of unity. So it's creating that sense of unity where everyone feels comfortable and not exploited or sort of exposed or marginalised that becomes very central to that particular dimension. Okay, the third dimension of safe space, the social cultural, is related obviously to this previous dimension. It's more about fostering familiarity, mutual recognition, and shared meaning regardless of one's social locations, such as race, ethnicity, gender, etc. Practical considerations around cross-community representation, participatory approaches, including consultations with disparate community groups. And one particular thing is around the issue of ensuring that all participants are able to experience a sense of belonging within the project and don't feel excluded, which includes respect for difference, preventing discrimination, inequity, etc. So a key example here is again from the Vencer program, where they've had long-standing discussions around whether to have a co-ed program or one that's only for girls and young women. And they talk about particularly some of the challenges of having co-ed and some of the women feeling uncomfortable there versus situation where you have a gender-specific project but where you then miss certain opportunities for transformative potential because it's only girls, and in the outside world actually gender relations are more complex and we're not really able to address those. So those are some of the issues that play a role there. So I'll leave the quotes up for you to read. Fourthly, the political dimension of safe space, again related to this, is about building open dialogue, respect for political difference, and a shared sense of community. Here, practical considerations, particularly in projects that operate in sort of highly volatile, politicized conflict areas, of which Israel is most definitely one, and Sri Lanka for a long time has been one, is to do with whether you want a project, for example, to be politically neutral. You want it to be non-political and basically free of politics. So the popular saying, sport and politics don't mix. Or do you actually try to seize this opportunity and encourage political dialogue and have uncomfortable conversations that can actually start breaking down some barriers and prejudice and build interfaith dialogue, for example. And that's actually where some of the transformative potential may lie from some of these projects. So one of the volunteers from the Football for Peace said, I would like to be able to talk about the realities in this country, the situation between Arabs and Jews. I would like us to be able to put a finger on the wound and not be afraid of that. So that sort of indicates a little bit how this person wants to move into that experiential dimension of safe space, yet this particular project, and many projects, don't dare to go there. They actually opt for sort of a more safe approach in the sense of not allowing really those kinds of political discussions and portraying itself as being politically neutral. There's an interesting tension there. And that tension brings us to the fifth dimension, which is around experimental dimension of safe space, where there is a need to encourage the creative risk and tension which can unleash that transformative potential of sport development. We found that this is a dimension that is least addressed in present sort of sport development practices, where, as I said, the other four dimensions tend to sort of be emphasized more, and therefore in doing so, a risk-free environment is being created where the experimental dimension is not really happening. Now, what do I mean by this, just briefly, is in terms of practical considerations, allowing participants to venture into unfamiliar spaces, pushing and transgressing boundaries, which might be risky and leave them vulnerable to fear or prejudice or stigmatization, which, if successful, can actually hold much greater transformative potential. So one of the projects that I work with, the Vencer program in Brazil, actually works specifically in this space of working with young favela residents, actually taking them out into the city, into middle-class areas, and trying to build more interactions between favela residents and middle-class residents of middle-class areas. And that was a hugely transformative experience for some participants, on both sides of the divide, if you like. So the quote I put up here is just about that, and the idea that they used to look upon these different areas with fear and prejudice, but actually when engaging in these kinds of encounters, so the quote here from one of the participants, we became equalized. So we live here and we don't know. We remain prisoners in our own little world. It's great to know places and people on the outside. And this particular project tried to put in place a number of sort of techniques and initiatives that tried to do things like this, that were, yes, they were risky and uncomfortable and full of tension, but they were actually the ones that seemed to generate the most genuine sort of social change. So just briefly, conscious of the time, to sum up some of the key conclusions and implications. So we would argue that the building of safe spaces, and particularly these 5 dimensions, is a vital ingredient of sport for development that requires strategic planning, facilitation, and significant consideration within project design. And all these 5 different dimensions need to be considered, and particularly how they intersect and how they enable, disable, impede, or actually build on each other is quite interesting. The key here is not to create an environment that is free of risk or tension or conflict. It actually allows for some of the tensions, ambiguities, and risks to be experienced, and facilitators. And this is where the role of facilitators and educators become extremely important in trying to manage and deal with and capitalize on these kinds of experiences of experimentation. And it is when these kinds of safe spaces are contentious and risky, yet playful, pleasurable, and mutually respectful and inclusive, that's when the greatest possibilities for social change arise. So this has some significant implications, obviously, for policy and practice. And these are the sort of things we're working on at the moment. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your feedback and questions. Thank you.
Right, I've failed in my duties perhaps as moderator already. We're a little bit over time, but we've got 5 minutes for questions. I will take a couple of questions, and if you can speak into the microphone, I'll pass it around so that Ramon can hopefully catch the question as well.
Thank you. Ramon, following your very interesting presentation, what I missed was the ownership, which is a very, very strong element, especially in the physical space. Then, of course, who is in charge of the quality assurance to allow maybe somebody with a different disability, to allow the girl child and the rest? These are things that I didn't see. Of course, there were some theorizing there, but the quality assurance, who is in charge and who is there, who claims ownership of these safe spaces, the 5 areas mentioned? Because if you come to a slum in Accra, it is totally different. And what I have read about the favelas in Brazil, it is also totally different. Then you go to the South African townships, totally different. And is there not a danger of mushrooming these qualities and these ownership things, just as the sports for development organizations themselves have done? Thank you.
Did you catch that question, Ramon?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. It's a very good question. It links into what I said earlier about, that this building of safe space, it doesn't happen by itself, right? It doesn't happen naturally, but it's something that we need to think about in terms of when we develop and implement projects, and that absolutely includes the issue of quality insurance. So how do we go about that the people who are trying to facilitate this, or from a pedagogy perspective, work with participants, right, to make this happen, that they actually are well equipped to deal with some of these issues, and some of these issues are sensitive, complex, and full of risk themselves. So it's a very good point. Related to that, the other point you make, and I tried to stress in the presentation, that each particular development context, each particular space where sport for development is happening is unique in some ways. There are always sort of processes and mechanisms, I guess, that cut through different locations, but ultimately this is highly context-specific and situational. So, for example, what we found is that in Brazil, there weren't such issues around the political dimension of safe space. There wasn't such a big issue, whereas then if you go to Israel, that was hugely contentious about certain groups not wanting to engage within projects, or at least there was a big effort actually to get everyone around the same table and actually start having these conversations. So yes, the particular importance, I guess, or significance, or the challenges of developing each of these dimensions will be different in each context, and some dimensions might be more prominent in some than in others. So what you mentioned about disability, for example, which for me is very much also not just about the physical aspect, the physical space aspect of creating a suitable environment, but also the social, cultural, right, and stigma, and sort of how to provide an inclusive environment. That's another key issue that in some areas will be extremely complex and need to be thought through and facilitated very professionally. In other context might align more with existing practice that is going on and that already provides some opportunities or strategies for doing so. But yeah, they're very good points. Thank you.
Fantastic. We've got time for one very brief question and hopefully a brief answer. This is David Bander.
Hi Ramon, it's Davis Bander. Ramon, I want to draw you to the issue of experimental safe space. You talked about transgressing boundaries. How do you manage the potential negative outcomes? Having worked on a project similar pedagogical approach myself, there's potential that you can kind of reconfirm prejudices that the participants have. You take them from their poor area into an affluent area, and after maybe that game of golf, and they feel like, oh, I might as well smash this window of the Jaguar because that man was nasty to me. So how do you manage that?
Good question, Ian. I'll give you a short answer. Good point. A short answer is probably that I don't have the right answer either. But I think that's sort of part of that process, I think, of experimentation, is working through some of these issues and how some of these issues might be resolved. So yes, you're right, it can actually be confirmed prejudice. But the alternative of not addressing prejudice at all, one might argue, is also not a very sound sort of strategy if we want to produce social change. So again, it's an area of ambiguity and tension that is worth, I think, exploring further and capitalising on, whilst recognising your point that this is not easy and this can actually have negative consequences for sort of psychological safety. So again, how these different sort of dimensions intersect and might actually be in tension with each other, I think, is something to recognise. So yeah, very good point. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'd like to appreciate Ramon once more. Ramon is going to stay with us, hopefully from Australia, if the connection can stay with us.
Yeah.
And I can work this out. We'll get the lights back on in here. I'd just also like to welcome up our second presenter here today, who we've got Solveig Straume, who's going to present. You can introduce your own title of your own presentation.
Thank you.
I'll give you a slide in about 5 minutes to go.
Yeah. Can I use this one?
Yes.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here and I'm looking forward to present to you some of results from a research project that I conducted with my colleague Anders Hasselgaard, and which has recently been published through 2 articles in the International Journal of Sport Policies and Politics. Anders sends his greetings to those of you who knows him. He's not able to be here as he's finalizing his PhD at the moment, which is on this very topic. So the title of today's presentation is Sport for Development, Norwegian Policy Discourse and Local Practice in Zimbabwe. First, I'll go through a quick background. Can you all see this? Or is it light? Right? No, it's okay. Good. Over the years, the Norwegian Confederation of Sport, or NIF, has been granted considerable funding by the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORA, to implement sport for development projects in the global south. The Norwegian Sport for Development engagement commenced in 1983 when NIF initiated a program called Sport for All in the Tanzanian city of Dar es Salaam. This program lasted for 6 years, during which time NIF aimed to implement common ideas rooted in the Norwegian sports movement, with Sport for All as the ultimate ideal. In 1991, NIF started supporting the Zimbabwe Sport and Recreation Commission, or SRC, through a Sport for Development project. The project in Zimbabwe followed in the same course as that of Tanzania, and thus the initial objective of the cooperation was to contribute to the development of mass sports structures and systems throughout the country, and to implement the idea of sport for all, based on the so-called Norwegian sports model. In the long run, the project was intended to contribute to broader social development, such as a focus on democracy, human rights, and gender issues. And hence, the focus of the cooperation has been both on development of and development through sports. In 2008, Norad decided to fund the establishment of the Community Sport Development Program, or the CSDP, developed by the SRC in participation with NIF and UNICEF. The main objective of the CSDP was to become a superior national sport system under which all mass sport activities were unified, ultimately under SRC as the umbrella organization, which is the same way as the Norwegian sport movement is built up. Further, the CSDP has two main functions. First, it aims at establishing community sport clubs in the disciplines football, netball, athletics, and volleyball in all 10 provinces of the country. And secondly, it aims to expand the so-called Youth Education Through Sports program, or YES program, which is a youth-driven program that educates young people about HIV/AIDS and other issues affecting their lives, while simultaneously installing a sense of community responsibility. An important part of this YES program is to facilitate sports tournaments for children enrolled in the CSDP program. To conduct the study, we applied a combination of archive and documental research, as well as field observations in and around Harare in February 2012. For written sources, we visited public archives at NORAD, at the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Harare, as well as NIF archives. The majority of written sources comprise policy documents, project plans, applications to NORAD, and project reports, as well as minutes from meetings and personal and formal correspondence. As the main focus of our research in Zimbabwe was on the transition from project design to practical implementation in different local contexts, it was important to have both formal and informal conversations with a variety of people involved at different levels on the Zimbabwean side. We therefore, as you can see, conducted 16 interviews with the Zimbabwean informants who have been or still are involved in the NIF-SRC cooperation. These included members of the SRC leadership and staff of the head office, and also the voices of local project staff, such as province coordinators and local implementers, providing important perspectives on the matter. These were supplemented with 8 interviews with Norwegian volunteers working with SRC in the practical implementation of the projects in Zimbabwe. Additionally, 2 interviews with representatives from NIF were carried out in Oslo. And further, field observations in the communities of our study enabled us to get a fuller picture of the everyday life of the project. So, let's go to the research question again, which is how are Norwegian influenced official discourses of the CSDP translated and given meaning by the recipient organization or local project staff in the social context where the CSDP is implemented? So the official discourses we mean the written policies that we find in the plans and project plans. Over to the findings. One of the main objectives of the CSDP was to establish after-school community sport clubs, which offer training for children and youth in 4 priority sport disciplines. In the communities of our study, however, the CSDP concept is implemented in different ways and gets its local expression by being integrated in the school sport system. In some communities, this led to a hybrid sport club model, because organizing additional after-school sport clubs is seen to be redundant from a local perspective. In this respect, it's important to understand that sport in Zimbabwe has traditionally been organized on a number of platforms, including schools. Thus, working with already established systems for sport seems to be preferred, rather than establishing new structures. Local project staff expressed that implementation of the CSDP within the local school system has had several positive effects. First, there is a perception that both parties benefit from the cooperation. The local schools, as they receive instruction in teaching sports. The CSDP complement the school sports by providing sport opportunities for the children during school hours on a regular basis, at the weekends, and in school terms where sport is less of a priority. As an informant said, as you can read, the project has rejuvenated school sport, even though the emphasis was community sport. Most of the coaching development is with the teachers. Local project staff in all the provinces we visited expressed that the schools are a natural collaboration arena and basis for the CSDP. As one of the district coordinators said, the kids who are participating in the school sports are the ones in the community clubs. So sometimes the schools are at the center of the community club. An important reason for the CSDP to integrate with the local schools is that schools have the infrastructures and facilities needed to implement the CSDP. More importantly, however, is it that such cooperation gives the CSDP access to the children enrolled in schools, since many parents or guardians do not want their children to participate in after-school sport activities when sport has already been given attention in schools. Additionally, local project staff claim that recruiting children to after-school clubs were not easy because in many communities, and particularly in the rural areas, there are often long distances between the schools and homes. Consequently, most children were not able to get home after practice before dark, and transfer home after practice were not accessible for most children. The early darkness in Zimbabwe was also an obstacle in the realization of after-school activities, since sports grounds were seldom illuminated and facilities and sports grounds in school were mostly locked in the afternoon. Thus, the assumption that the after-school club model did not create a safe environment or safe spaces, Ramon was talking about, for the children clearly set the premises for how the CSDP was implemented in the communities we visited. This was pointed out by several informants, and as one stated, one should question whether the Norwegian after-school club structure should be the ideal for Zimbabwe. There are different challenges here, such as the early darkness, lack of illuminated areas, and that many children live far away from where the activities are run. If children need to stay in school for after-school activities, how will they get home before dark? There are no parents driving their children to and from practice here. Ultimately, it's a matter of safety for the children. The strong connection between the schools and the CSDP was especially visible in the selection of teams for the annual YES Games that I talked about earlier. According to the CSDP policy, teams to the YES Games must be registered in a CSDP club. However, as one informant said, many of the YES Games teams are a result of what they call a community club, but in reality, it's a school team. Several other informants told similar stories to this. For instance, teams were selected from schools on the basis of their ability to fund their own transportation to the tournament in that they owned the bus. Teams were also recruited from other venues, such as, for instance, specialized football academies, or even randomly selected from streets. Essentially, this was a problem when it came to the registration of activities, which is a requirement for NIF and NURA, as some implementers use fixtures or temporary after-school community clubs and teams, and thereby creating an illusion that sustainable after-school clubs activities had been developed. The CSDP, articulated through project reports, seems to be implemented according to the CSDP ideology, whereas in reality, registered teams are often the result of a strategic act by local project staff. This illustrates how the structure in this project are sustained despite the discrepancy between the policies, and how the project is implemented in practice. Another fundamental principle of the Norwegian sports model is its focus on volunteerism. An SRC representative expressed that they were greatly inspired by this element of the Norwegian sports model in the development of CSDP. And thus, the sport volunteer facilitator's role is key to the success of the project, also for the Zimbabwean CSDP. However, several informants pointed out that volunteerism is one of the core challenges in the implementation of the CSDP, both among parents and other adults. There were several explanations for this. First, in 2008, the year CSDP was implemented, Zimbabwe was on the verge of a financial breakdown. The country had the world's highest inflation rate and experienced experienced an exponential unemployment rate. It was stated that in times of hardship, parents have limited time and resources to prioritize engagement in their children's sports and to run the clubs. Second, as pointed out, sports have been institutionalized in schools, and teachers have mainly been engaged in children's sport. Hence, there's been no tradition for sports-related volunteerism among parents. An additional point that came up in interviews is the attitude of some parents towards sports, where the emphasis on sports in children's development is considered less important than academic studies. As a Zimbabwean volunteer working as a coach expressed, some of them do not understand the importance of sports. They take it from their own perspective and have this old understanding that sport is being played by unsuccessful people. So if you fail to do well in school, you can play sport. These findings correspond with earlier sport development studies showing that parents may be a source of resistance to SDP or equivalent programs. In order to translate this idea of volunteerism to become a fundamental principle at the grassroots level of Zimbabwean sport, one component of the CSDP is to train local volunteers to run projects in the different communities. However, as one informant stated, there are few volunteers who really understand what volunteerism is all about, and they expect retentions from the SRC or the organizations which they work with. Sometimes we do lose volunteers because they come on board expecting to get some benefits, but when they discover that they're not benefiting, they quit. So volunteer dropout is a problem. These findings show that volunteerism, as understood in the Norwegian sports model, was not easily transferable to the local communities we visited. Although some informants expressed that they wanted to bring something back to the community through engagement in sport activities, for many volunteers, the expectation seems to be more at an individual rather than a collectivist level. The reasons for this vary. However, the economic crisis and high unemployment rate seems to be an important explanation. A general understanding in the communities we visited was the possibility of benefiting economically or in other ways through voluntary work. For instance, social mobility in the SRC chain. Our analysis of the CSDP formal discourse, formal policy, shows that the NIF-SRC partnership implies a transfer flow of knowledge, concepts, ideas and values, which largely follow the resources from donor to recipient. The donor sets the terms. We see, for instance, that the traditional idea of organizing sport through the Zimbabwean school system has been given up in favor of the Norwegian club model structure, governed by SRC as a unifying umbrella organization. However, our findings show that the Norwegian sport for development discourses are modified when the focus shifts from the formal discursive level to the practical implementation level. Implementers generate local knowledge, local contextual counter tendencies to bridge separate systems of knowledge by implementing a hybrid community sport club model within the local schools where sport traditionally has been organized. In this way, local project staff simultaneously overcome local contextual challenges, such as the lack of safe spaces, lack of volunteer engagement, and sports low status performance. Local project staff may consent to the imposed ideas, values, and concepts, but in practice need to make something quite different of them. And consequently, such issues as democracy, which is very central to the Norwegian sport model, is not being emphasized to the extent it is planned. This does not mean that local project staff do not relate to policy documents and project plans. In fact, they relate to them and also work actively to sustain them through project reports to NIF, because it is in their interest to secure further project funding from their donors. This reveals the complex social life and agency of actors within this project and how different worldviews are negotiated. The gap between the ideal world presented in the official discourses and practice from the donor's point of view will often be seen as a disjuncture between the intention and outcome, frequently explained in terms of bad planning or lack of resources. This reveals a contradiction, however. Whereas NIF can work from the perspective of their external knowledge, and indicators may regard the CSDP as failing or not doing as the policy says, Most local project staff in our study seem to understand the implemented hybrid model as a success, since it strengthens sport for the local community where this is natural. This emphasizes the important question of who should set the terms of reference for what is to be measured as a success and failure in sport for development projects. The way in which the CSDP is adapted to local needs and local knowledge should not be seen as a criticism of the CSDP leadership or local implementers and the implemented hybrid model, but rather as a positive example of local agency and how CSDP works in practice. From our results, we call for a better understanding of the development process, seen from the perspective of actors in the global south, that can help us unveil the multiple realities determining how sport for development is experienced among different actors and people's conflicting interests and intentions, which affect the way that sport for development projects are implemented in practice. Thank you for your attention. It's definitely there because the local project staff, they have transformed this idea, or they have translated this idea. So they're making something else out of it, rather than what's supposed to be. Yeah? So they feel that it's their project, and they work well with the schools, for instance. So this project goes on in a different way than the policy says, but that's not really a problem for them. Neither does it seem to be a problem for NIF, as long as they are fulfilling some of the requirements. So this project is sustained, more or less. Of course, it has its challenges, but it seems to be sustainable because it's the Zimbabwean people themselves that are running them. Rather than other projects, for instance, I refer to the Tanzanian project, which I studied through my PhD, which was a typical example of a Norwegian project in Zimbabwe. Rather than becoming a in Tanzania, rather than becoming a Tanzanian project, because there were Norwegian so-called experts that were going there and they were running and watching over and everything. So there seems to be a difference there. And then, can you repeat?
Yes, the potential of a danger or conflict between the donor organizations, the organization in the north, and then the S4D project or...
yeah, when we talk about concepts such as democracy, human rights, and stuff like...
Okay, please.
Yeah, because we all know that I guess this whole idea of what they try to implement, a Norwegian model, it's not the same in Zimbabwe. But and we all know that it's different. What is democracy in Zimbabwe? What is democracy in Norway? It's different. And so I think the project struggles probably with if you attempt to translate it directly from what we mean in Norway and what they mean in Zimbabwe. But the whole idea of democracy, for instance, is what to be seen through, for instance, the Yes Games, which is focusing on participation on every level of the organization, that children and youth should be included. So it's democracy on that level, which is also visible in many sport development projects. In particular, my support, we can discuss it in private later.
We've got time for one more question, Dr. Manuel.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Right. Two things came up strongly in your presentation, that is development of sport and development through sport. I think I got your point very well if it comes to development through sport. Yeah, but then I want a little light on the development of sport in your study, because if you talk of development of sport, then you're talking about facility provision, equipment, sport science, discourse, and identification of talent and development of the talent to compete at the elite level. Because most donors see development of sports as putting a propaganda tool in the hands of government to enhance their visibility. Okay? But then when it comes to development through sports, that's where you are really helping the grassroots, the communities, the individual, the deprived people to inculcate into them the values of sport.
Yeah.
So I got your point very well if it comes to development through sport. But then, did you
Yes.
tackle
I didn't say so much about the development of sport, but NIF, which is the Norwegian Confederation of Sport, has had this idea that since they started sport development quite early, and they were very concerned that they wanted to go, they didn't want to go and create competing sports structures to the ones that were already there. Their interest in the first one was to go to, for instance, Zimbabwe, and work with the national or the Sport and Recreation Commission and build the organization. That would be the development of sport. They would help them to figure out how to run leagues, for instance, which is development of sport. And then you have, they are strongly opposing, as they are in their own, in our own country, this whole talent identification. So the mass sport philosophy, if you can call it that, is very, very strong in the Norwegian sport movement. So NIF is also very cautious to that. So when asked if they, for instance, could fund a sport academy or a talent football academy, they wouldn't do that, for instance. So, but traditionally, this working with their sister organizations in the south has been a very strong point for them, which I would say is development of sport for them.
I'd just like to welcome our third speaker, Lino Gisselberg. Right? Excuse the pronunciation. From the University of Freiburg, who's going to present on sport and social change in Indonesia.
So, welcome to you all. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Lena Gisselberg, and I'm a research associate and PhD student from the University of Freiburg in Germany. Today I'd like to give you an overview of activities, sport for development activities in Indonesia, and present some preliminary findings. In the introduction, I want to define and specify the concept of sport and sport for development very briefly, as you are probably all familiar with that. Also, I will give some background information about Indonesia, some facts and figures, as well as the current challenges, current development challenges and social issues. Subsequently, I will present the objective of this study and the guiding research questions, followed by a brief look at the state of research on sport for development in Indonesia. Then I want to share my approach with you, give information about the data collection, interview partners, and so on. The next part will be the presentation of some first results. I will conclude with a summary and the Indonesian perspective of sport for social change, and finally discuss the limitations. Then we will hopefully have time for questions. Okay, what is sport? In sport for development, there is a broad understanding of sport, following the Sport for All approach, as you already mentioned. The United Nations Interagency Task Force defines sport in development settings as all forms of physical activity that contribute to physical fitness, mental well-being, and social interaction. These include play, recreation, organized, casual, or competitive sport, indigenous games, and indigenous sport and games. Actually, there are different concepts of social change. For this study, the primary focus is on the Indonesian understanding of social change in the specific sporting context. Different concepts and terminologies, such as social change, social development, exist and are being discussed. Same situation applies with sport for development. There is no common or consistent terminology. We hear different terms like sport in development, sport and development, sport for development, but basically all follow the same idea. So to use sport as a tool in development efforts. To be honest, I decided to name it Sport for Social Change because many of the interviews refer to that term. So I decided to name it social change. But of course I have to investigate the different concepts of social change and social development to draw conclusions on that. When we look at the concept of sport for development, it captures the idea of using sport to address development-related social and also economic challenges. Or to put it in the words of the Sport for Development and Peace International Working Group, to attain specific development objectives in low and middle income countries and disadvantaged communities in high income settings. In Sport for Development, sport is seen as a tool or a platform to promote, for example, public health, education, child and youth development, social inclusion, among others. So some information about Indonesia. I hope you can see from that quite well. Indonesia lies in Southeast Asia, Eastern Asia, between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It's the world's largest archipelagic state with more than 17,000 islands. Approximately 6,000 are inhabited. From east to west, Indonesia is equivalent to the distance from London to Tehran. And the 5 main islands, starting from the left of Indonesia, are Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and Papua. Some facts today. Indonesia is home to 1 in every 30 of the people on this planet. So nearly 2/3 of all the Indonesians live on Java, which is more or less in the middle. The total population is 240 million. As you can see in the headline, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is the official national motto of Indonesia and can be translated in unity in diversity. Indonesia has a unique diversity of tribes, language, culture, customs, and religion. And as the capital city, this is mirrored in the capital city Jakarta, which is in Java. Some interesting facts. Jakarta tweets more than any other city on earth. And around 64 million use Facebook, which is more than the entire population of the UK. And at the same time, 80 million live without electricity. That's the entire population of Germany. Sorry. Yeah, just a brief summary. Indonesia is the 5th largest country in the world. It's the largest Muslim nation state. It's highly ethnically diverse and more than 700 languages are used. Coming to the development challenges. As I said, out of the population of 240 million, which is the total population of Indonesia, more than 110 million live on less than $2 a day. So poverty is a development challenge. Access to health care, to safe water and sanitation, maternal and child health, HIV/AIDS surveillance, malnutrition, quality of education, and high unemployment rates among young Indonesians are just some of the main social and economic challenges the country is facing. Also, according to Picard and Marigny, the country's religious pluralism is another present-day challenge. So, the study is a first attempt to provide an overview on the SFD movement in Indonesia. In order to generate first insights on the Indonesian perspective, I conducted interviews in March 2014 with different actors. The objective of this study was to map different organizations and projects that use sport, physical activity, and play as tools. The key questions guiding this research were: what sort of projects exist, what topics are covered and by whom, Who are actors and stakeholders, international or local? Organizations, where do organizations operate? What are major objectives? Who are target groups? What kind of sports and activities are utilized? So as you can see, I collected a lot of data, basically as much information as possible to get a comprehensive overview of what is going on in Indonesia. Why? Because according to Okada and Yang, empirical research in developing countries such as in Latin American settings, South Asian and Islamic settings, compared to SFD studies conducted in Africa, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, remains limited. So the role of sport in development in Asia, but particularly in Southeast Asia, has hardly been covered. There's no research on Indonesian SFD activities so far. There are some project evaluations from projects in Vietnam, Thailand, and other Southeast Asian countries, but none of Indonesian projects, at least no official or published ones. Different strategies were employed to identify SFD organizations and projects across Indonesia. A systematic exploration was conducted in form of expert consultations, online research, electronic literature research, and through personal networks. Data were collected from 16 organizations, 2 semi-structured interviews in person, 6 via Skype, and 9 via email were conducted with initiators and project managers. The expert interviews were conducted in March 2014, which I already mentioned, and lasted between 14 and 43 minutes. 11 of the 17 experts were Indonesian, 4 of them were female. The experts were between 27 and 59 years old and had different educational and professional backgrounds, as well as experience in sport for development. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to finish data analysis until today. Current state of analysis is aggregating information as case summaries or organization profiles. Collected data will be analyzed. I'm doing it right now, using a combination of inductive and deductive qualitative content analysis. And the organization summaries will help to understand the inner logic of organizations and projects. Sorry. Yes, more than 20 organizations have been identified, which you can see here. Here are organizations marked, but not all of the projects, just the organizations. Most of the organizations have multiple programs across Indonesia, as you can see in that quote. We work in every province in Indonesia, which is geographically massive, and the equivalent of running projects from London to Doha, is one interviewee saying. Additionally, 8 international SFD actors and approximately another 20 stakeholders have been identified. One international SFD actor has started a partnership network in 2012 between 11 organizations, of which 10 have been interviewed. Interestingly, most of them are local, non-profit, and non-governmental grassroots organizations. Data were collected from 60, I already said that, of which 10 are located in Java, 2 in Papua, 2 in Maluku Islands, 1 in East Nusa Tenggara, which is West Timor, and 1 in Bali. 6 only focus on urban areas, and 10 also focus on rural, so both urban and rural areas. On this chart, you can see the founding years of the organizations. The blue dots stand for how many organizations were founded in that year. For example, in 1996, no organization was founded. It started in 1992 with the creation of a sports association in Ambon, Maluku Islands, and goes until 2011 with the foundation of an NGO in Papua, which focuses on football for social change. Football has been found to be the most popular sports in Indonesia, followed by badminton. Futsal is probably the second popular, or even the same level as football, but it hasn't been mentioned here probably because people put it together with football. 12 organizations use football for social change, of which 6 of them only focus on football. The others use several sports activities. The other 4 use martial arts, rugby, inclusive games, and adapted physical activities such as wheelchair basketball or blind judo. About the target groups. Most of the SDP actors in Indonesia work with children and youth, predominantly disadvantaged children and youth. 2 organizations only focus on girls, 4 on people with disabilities, and 3 are working with women, among other target groups. So in sum, one can conclude that the identified organizations address a great variety of target groups, and mostly several at the same time. The Indonesian organizations cover a wide range of SDP topics and themes, as you can see here, such as child and youth development, including topics like personal development. Objectives are to reduce violence and strengthen the local culture, to improve the quality of education and health, the fight against drug and alcohol abuse, HIV/AIDS, and to create awareness among society. As well as social inclusion, including social justice, such as the fight against social stigma and discrimination, breaking down stereotypes. Some also focus on capacity development in terms of peer education. They run, for example, coaching clinics and workshops for trainers. 2 of them focus, for instance, solely on sport or technical skills, which you can refer to Sport Plus projects or sport development of sport projects, such as football and rugby. But you can conclude all of them are aiming to provide access to sport, physical activity and play. They want to provide sport participation opportunities, mostly in combination with educational activities. Again, data shows that organizations have multiple objectives and cover several SFD themes. Partners are basically international development and health agencies, corporations, international SFD actors, also local NGOs, local communities, international Indonesian sport associations, schools, and also universities. Also, you can find Indonesian and foreign government bodies who are supporting organizations. Financial support comes from the institutions I've just mentioned, but another interesting finding is that most of the financial support comes from international organizations, but also from SFD actors, private donors, and foreign governments. A few receive financial support from the Indonesian government, and some other act as foundations and use personal funds. The majority doesn't have a secured but project-based funding. Some also generate income through, for example, running football academies or offering physical education classes in schools. Out of these 16 interviewed organizations, 10 are using monitoring and evaluation tools. Most interviewees mentioned the need for and lack of effective monitoring and evaluation systems to actually assess the impact of their intervention. They use basic M&E tools to get a sense of levels of participation, as well as training processes and progress, but are not using sophisticated tools that are informed by research. The most frequently questioned mentioned obstacles and difficulties are funding, government regulations and inactivity, high transportation costs, human resources in terms of finding good staff, finding good coaches, no willingness of volunteering, and all of them agree on the poor awareness of sport as a tool. Also that it is quite challenging to introduce sport for development as an approach, for example, to the government, to the society, schools, parents, and so on. Therefore, many initiatives explicitly are trying to raise awareness in society and seek to engage with the government, for example, through events and tournaments. Social challenges are stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV, people who use drugs, people with disabilities, or ethnic and religious minorities. Further, social exclusion, intolerance, the big gap between rich and poor, increasing inequality, lack of education, violence, and bullying in schools have been mentioned as current social challenges in the interviews. Just one quote of the project manager in Papua. Papua's young generation are being impacted by bad social influences such as drugs, alcoholism, free sex, HIV/AIDS, low school participation rate, and conflicts between Indonesian government and the local military. So, what is social change through sport in Indonesia? In the Indonesian context, social change is understood, for instance, as the fight against HIV/AIDS and social stigma, the empowerment of girls and women and people with a disability, as well as social inclusion in general. Data shows that most of the identified organizations work towards solving some of the main social, sometimes also economic challenges the country is facing. Most of them are local grassroots non-profit NGOs and focus on disadvantaged children and youth. They use sport as a tool for social inclusion, personal and community development. They try to run long-term initiatives and mostly have project-based funding. Here are 3 more quotes. Due to the time, I will just read one. SDP is what we have been doing here for the past 12 years, using sport as a vehicle to engage and educate disadvantaged youth and young adults to help improve lives long-term sustainably in order to develop and build strong communities and schools across the region. So the study has several limitations beside the fact of the current status work in progress due to challenges related to conducting the interviews, which were financial aspects, time problems, language issues, long distances, bad internet connection, and so on. And also, firstly, only one perspective has been covered in form of expert interview partners, mostly with initiators and founders, as well as project managers. That could be another focus to illuminate, for example, the perspective of target groups, or again, focus on the different stakeholders, or also involve parents. There were only 2 interviews in person, the rest via Skype and email, which is also a limitation. And actually, it is unclear how many organizations or projects definitely exist. As more than the interviewed 16 organizations have been identified, I only collected data from 16. Also, further distinctions and classifications have to be made in terms of different actors, stakeholders, donors, and partners, and differentiate precisely between organizations and projects, and what are projects, what are programs. This is actually an issue of terms and terminologies, which is another issue. I identified organizations with various projects. So basically, I have just been able to provide a broad overview and no in-depth information. So further research will be required as, for example, as comprehensive project evaluations and investigations to measure, for example, intended impact versus actual outcomes of projects and interdependencies between sport-related activities and social development. Okay, and thank you for your attention.
Any questions? I'll ask. I would have a few questions here, I guess. Our first question would be, to what extent do you feel that these organisations and what they do is particularly Indonesian, or does it represent some of the distinction divisions, organisations that are out there in the wider field of sport development?
As we have seen, basically they cover a lot of topics out of SFD, the SFD field. What I find quite interesting is that that most of them are local NGOs. So I was talking mostly to Indonesian project managers and not international. There are some international actors involved, but more in terms of trying to build networks and try to bring the different actors, Indonesian actors, together to have like joint projects. What else? And another thing is, for me, as I have personal experience in Indonesia, it is interesting that there is no research about Indonesia. So I try to make this work visible and to have the discussion, but also have this Indonesian perspective. And
I just wondered, you say it's local NGOs, but how are these funded? Are they funded from international organizations?
as I said, it's more like project-based funding. So for every little project, they have different fundraising. But mostly it's funded by international organizations, yeah, that's true. But the projects are run by local NGOs. Sometimes international experts are involved. For example, I identified 2 or 3 organizations where there is someone from the UK who was the initiator, but only local staff is actually working in the project. Yeah.
It's not a question, it's just an addition to what she said. In terms of literature, she's saying that the field, there is no literature maybe in relation to sport for development. Maybe it's possible to connect it to the session this morning, the keynote session. Can we go outside our field and look at other sectors what we have done? For example, in Indonesia, definitely there will be foreign funding coming into fisheries. And how have those organizations worked with those fisheries in order to change their traditional methods of containing their marines and all that? What relationships, what partnerships have been there, and how has power been distributed within those partnerships?
Yeah.
So we could then draw from that literature, just like Trevor was talking in the morning, we could draw from that literature and bring it into here and say, this is what has been done in this field, and these are maybe the mistakes we are making in sport for development, because our friends have already learned here, their fingers got burnt in how bad their relationships were.
Thank you, very good point. Yeah, that would be like the next step for me also. I try to have a joint project with Southeast Asian experts, because I'm not the expert about Indonesia, so to combine this knowledge and experience.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Indeed, sport for development is a new area, and we need such, PhD thesis to support our advocacy for support from governments and other donor agencies. Yeah, you started your presentation by, this dilemma, with the dilemma of terminology, sports in development, sports and development, sports for development, sports for social change. I think clearly there are very clear dichotomy between these. So if we talk about sports and development, it is different from sports and development. Yeah, but I want to dwell on your presentation, sports for social change. You mentioned in passing about some of the negative aspects which you use sports to address. But then I'll be happy if you stress on that very well, because sports is one of the areas where it is, have very negative traits, because it is in sports where you have antisocial vices like hooliganism, you have violence, you have drug abuse, you have bribery and corruption. If you've been reading about, all these bidding processes, what happens. Yeah. So if we talk about sports for social change, we should be able to specify that it is actually to eliminate the negative traits and inculcate positive traits in the community and individuals and the nation as a whole. So this is where I think it will help bring out the point clearly that sports is being used to address HIV/AIDS, etc. But at the same time, we don't only gain knowledge by learning new things, but by learning or undoing some wrong things, behaviors. Okay, if you undo, it is also there. So your point, this is just a suggestion that strongly come out with the point that there are negative traits in sports, which you can use sports for social change. That is all for positive social change. Okay, so that you bring the differences and how sports can be used to address those differences.
Very good, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Going to lunch now, and the workshop will be back on at 2:30 this afternoon in the same venue. Thank you all for joining us.